Welcome back for another episode of Music Notes. So nice to see you all again. And as we are all preparing now, we are in the season of Advent. Let's take a listen to our hymn for today.
Veni, veni, Emmanuel, captivum sole Israel, qui cenit in exilio, privatus Dei filio,
So you have just been listening to the hymn, O come, Emmanuel. Now let's talk a little bit about the history of our hymn today. This hymn, the text anyway, dates back about 1,200 years ago, about the 8th and 9th century, and it came about in the monastic times, in medieval times. So it was the monks who were chanting these words. And the text here in our song today are considered the O antiphons. And the O antiphon, an antiphon is a psalm or an anthem. And the monks would sing these songs. They're 7 days, 7 verses, and they would sing them in the 7 days leading up to Christmas Eve. And it would lead up to the final verse, the 8th verse, which is the 8th antiphon, O Virgo Virginum, and that's O Virgin of Virgins. And that would be sung before and after Mary's canticle, where they would read the Magnificat, and that's in Luke chapter 1, verses 46 through 55. All right, so we mentioned that this goes back to monastery days, 8th and 9th century. And the Latin metrical form of this hymn, so putting it in meter and the chanting of it, that goes back to about 12th century. So it evolved, and by 12th century they had a metrical form of the hymn. And then it was finally published in Latin in 1710. And then after that, we go forward into the 1800s, and a gentleman by the name of John Mason Neale, he was an English minister. He comes across this Latin hymn and text in an appendix of an early 18th century manuscript, and it was called the Psalterium Catonum Catholicorum. Obviously, it's Catholic. And it had a refrain in there. And so when Neale came across this, he decided to weave together these segments of the verses to create the first draft of O Come, Emmanuel. And that goes on to be published in his pretty influential collection called Medieval Hymns and Sequences. And so that's in 1851. And at that time, the title of our song was called Draw Nigh, Emmanuel. Now, a little bit about Neale. He's an interesting fellow. He was born in London on January 24th, 1818, and he was the son of an evangelical Anglican clergyman. He attended Cambridge University, so very smart. They talk about him as a brilliant student and an award-winning poet, and he went on to become known as the famous architect of the Oxford movement. Do you remember when we talked about the Oxford movement? It was just a couple of episodes ago when we were talking about let all mortal flesh keep silence. And so if you remember, the Oxford movement was that time where some of the early texts of the Christian church were translated from Greek and Latin into English. And so they're taking kind of those metrical words that are put together and chanted, and then translating them into English, and then putting them with a tune, a hymn tune. So that's the Oxford movement. And our author today, John Mason Neale, he was considered the architect of that. So he did that with some other texts as well. Now about him, he became very interested in Roman Catholicism. Hence, probably why he was reading that 18th century manuscript, the Psalterium Cantionum Catholicorum. Okay, so he was interested in Catholicism. But by 1841, he was ordained into the Anglican ministry. However, due to poor health and also his leanings toward Catholicism, he was never able to have his own parish. But he did go on to become the director of Sackville College, which was a home for old men. So he's a very compassionate man. So he's running this home for old men. And interestingly enough, so that was in 41, so 200 years, or a little less than 200 years. It's 2021. That home that he ran 180 years ago is still in existence, and it is in East Grinstead, Sussex, and it is still operating. So that's kind of neat. Aside from that, Neale also founded a nursing order of Anglican nuns, and he helped with social welfare projects and organizations, and he cared for orphans and young women. So he was definitely out and about doing God's work and looking after the needy and protecting those. So back to his Catholic leanings and the way he viewed church music and what church should be. He was a traditionalist, a high church traditionalist. So if you've kind of been following along with the music notes, he did not like the text and the music that was put out by Isaac Watts. Isaac Watts was one of my favorite. So Isaac Watts was really good at taking the Psalms, for example, and then using some poetic license. And he would use literary devices to evoke images and emotion when you are singing his text, which is biblically sound. But no, Neil did not like that at all. So he did not care for Isaac Watts's music or text that he would write, his beautiful poetry. So they're both poets, but very different styles. So back to Neil, he longed to return Christianity to the liturgical dignity of church history. And some other well-known hymns that he wrote are Good King Wenceslas, Good Christian Men Rejoice, and one that we love to sing on Palm Sunday, All Glory, Laud, and Honor. So that's a little bit about the fellow Neil who discovers this text for O Come, Emmanuel. Now, about the text, let's take a look. In our hymnal, we can find O Come, Emmanuel on page 357. And if you look on the next page, 358, you will see there it says, the great O antiphons. And there are the dates that I mentioned, those 7 calendar days that lead up to Christmas Eve. And interesting, if you note, on December 17th, they have the first one as O wisdom. Okay, and that's not how we sing it. If you look over on the other page, 357, you'll say, well, wait a minute, that's not the first one. We sing O Come, Emmanuel as the first verse. Okay, so there's an interesting story behind that. So, British hymnologist, and we've brought him up a few times, J.R. Watson, he provides a context for the antiphons. This is what he says. The antiphons, sometimes called the O antiphons, or the great O's, he says they were designated to concentrate the mind on the coming of Christmas, enriching the meaning of the incarnation with a complex series of references to the Old and New Testament. Okay, so each verse references the Old Testament, and then there's one verse that references the Old and the New. And so we'll get to that in a moment. But so you see, if you're looking here, we have the 7 verses. And the first one, by date, as the monks would sing it, would be O wisdom. And then the next one, O Adonai, which is the Hebrew word for God. Then after that, O root of Jesse, O key of David, O dayspring, O King of the nations, and then finally the last one here is O Emmanuel, number 7. And that is how the monks would have chanted, 1 verse per day. So again, very liturgical. They're leading up to Christmas. And so all of the Latin attributions to the coming of the Messiah are from the Old Testament with one exception, and that exception is Emmanuel. Emmanuel is found in both Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, and it is also found in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. And in that, Matthew quotes Isaiah almost verbatim, except for the end. He says, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." And then, with the exception that Matthew adds the phrase, which is being interpreted as God with us. So that's added in Matthew, God with us. And that's very important. And so, as I mentioned, these were sung leading up to Christmas Eve, with the final one, O Emmanuel, on Christmas Eve. and it is revealing the meaning of the liturgical riddle, if you will. It's the completion of this puzzle, because it is a word puzzle. And we'll show that on the screen and explain that in just a minute. So each stanza, as you can see, consists of a four-line verse, which adapts one of the antiphons. And then it has that two-line refrain, rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel will be born for you, O Israel. And that provides kind of the explicit Advent oriented response to the petition of the verse. Okay, because this is all about the coming of Jesus. And then, probably still wondering though, why we have as verse 1, O come, Emmanuel, when the monks sang that toward the end on the day Christmas Eve before Jesus was born. So that order, the verse order, was altered so that the last of the O antiphons becomes the first in the hymn. Okay, and there's a reason for that. So that first verse now reads, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. So what's interesting about this verse in particular, and also the other verses, but this one especially, is they have a double purpose. So in these 7 verses, we realize that we're speaking of Jesus's birth, his coming, his birth. And at the same time, he was going to be the ransom paid to set Israel and the nations free. So when we sing these verses, and many of the other Christmas carols that we sing, our beloved carols that we sing, we're also kind of viewing the birth of Jesus as though we are living in the first century. And we're talking about baby Jesus being born in a manger, away in a manger, and on a silent night, and with angels singing and wise men coming. And so we are singing about that first birth of the baby Jesus, as though we were there in the first century. However, if you look at each of these 7 verses, again, with an eye toward Jesus's return, you'll discover that they have a hidden meaning or a double purpose. So let's look at our 7 verses again, and I'm going to put this up on the screen, and let's look at these words. We've got O wisdom, and in Latin that is O sapientia, and the next one is O Adonai, God. The third, O radix Jesse, and then O clavis David, O oriens, O rex genitium, and then O Emmanuel. So when you see this, take a look and you put the first letter of the second word of each antiphon together. It spells sarcore, S-A-R-C-O-R-E. And if read backwards, the letters form a 2-word acrostic. It's the puzzle. Ero-cras, E-R-O, and C-R-A-S. And that has a meaning. And the meaning is, I will be present tomorrow. So Jesus is coming back. So what do you think of that? That's pretty neat. So there's a hidden message within the song, beyond just the text that we're singing. The way it was written and the way those titles of each of those antiphons were purposeful and secretive. So you turn that second line into a word, turn it around backwards, and you have, I will be present tomorrow. Jesus is coming back. So this song that we are singing, we are not merely talking about the birth of Jesus Christ. We are talking about his return. And so when we sing the lyrics of this song, it's not just the celebration of baby Jesus, but we are preparing our hearts and growing in the excitement of Jesus's return, which could actually happen in our lifetime. We don't know. So in a sense, each verse is helping to place our eyes on Jesus's return by remembering that first coming. And then we are anticipating, yearning, hoping, and aching for that second coming of Jesus Christ. So, pretty fascinating. As we sing those verses, think about them from that viewpoint, as opposed to just the birth, but Jesus's return as he comes back to save us all. So I hope you have enjoyed learning more about O Come, Emmanuel, and I hope you enjoy our sound clip that I leave you with today. So happy Advent and Merry Christmas.